for having Mozilla back. My name is Asa Dotzler. I'm a Mozillian. I'm here to talk with you about Firefox OS. But as much as Firefox OS, I want to talk to you a little bit about what Mozilla is as well, because I think at Mozilla, why we build things and how we build things are often as important as the things we build themselves. So Mozilla's history really starts a long ways back, and I'm going to go a little bit further back even than that. In 1991, Tim Berners-Lee created an application called World Wide Web. It was the first web browser, eventually renamed because it conflicted with the name of the World Wide Web. But this first web browser gave people access to information all around the world. We saw the browser take off at academic institutions. In '92, Tim Berners-Lee and a couple of colleagues released libwww, which was a nice little portable C library that gave you HTTP, FTP, and a couple of other internet protocols. And libwww then spawned 4 or 5 browsers in 1992 and 93 and 94. Most of them you probably haven't heard of. They included browsers like, I wrote some down because I didn't even remember. Cello was a browser. There was a TKWWW that was a Tickle browser. There were a handful of them, but they were mostly all X. They were Unix browsers, and so they didn't see any real mainstream adoption. In 1993, a group of people were working on one of these X browsers at NCSA, which is the National Supercomputer Institution in the U.S., a division or a department within the University of Illinois. And they built a browser called Mosaic. And Mosaic was special for a couple of reasons. The first reason was Mosaic was the first browser to inline images. Before that, images were thought of as sort of an add-on to the browser, and you had a helper window. So when you loaded up a web page, you'd see all of the text come in, and then a little pop-up window with an image. And that was sort of how the web worked until Mosaic. Mosaic inlined those images, and it made a real difference in the usability. That was, I think, the first major innovation of the Mosaic browser. The second innovation, I don't know if you call it innovation, but they made Mosaic for Windows, and they made Mosaic for Macintosh, and they made Mosaic for Amiga, because Commodore Amiga was still around back then. And they made Mosaic, of course, for the various flavors of X, all the Unixes out there, AIX and HPUX and Solaris and all of the others. But the key thing was they made a web browser available on Windows, which is the primary computing platform for consumers in the early 90s. Most of those consumers had a Windows PC at work and were starting to buy Windows PCs at home, and this was the first web browser that worked well on Windows, as well as its X counterparts. So, as I talk to you today, I'm going to cover sort of 3 big stories, each of them about 10 minutes long. And each of them are interesting, I think, because they all have to do with naming. The first story has to do with an interesting name, Mozilla, and where we got it. And as you might suspect, it came out in the very early days and has some connection to Mosaic. So what's that connection? Mark Andreessen and I think Eric Bina and 2 or 3 other people from NCSA and the University of Illinois left the university, moved to Mountain View, Silicon Valley, California, and joined forces with an ex-executive from SGI and started a company called Mosaic Communications and built a web browser called Mosaic. Now you can imagine the people over at the university who had a browser called Mosaic that was worked on by these same guys said, that's kind of strange, that's our name. Did you take our code too? And they actually sued. They said they thought they ran off and absconded with the code. Turns out they didn't take the code. Writing a browser in 1993 was thousands, tens of thousands of lines of code, not the tens of millions of lines of code that it is today. The web was a simple concept and HTML was a much simpler feature set. But they did abscond with the name Mosaic and named their company Mosaic. And in settling with the university to get past that naming dispute and to prove the code was their own, they changed their name to Netscape. So they went from Mosaic Communications to Netscape Communications. They changed the name of the browser from Mosaic Browser to Netscape. Now, a couple of engineers working on the Netscape, now Netscape browser, were a little bit peeved that they had lost the name Mosaic, and they liked it. And they figured, hey, since I'm the one that came up with the name back at the university, I should get to take it with me. And one of those people decided that they were going to codename the first public version of Netscape Mozilla, which is a contraction of Mosaic Killa. And the idea was they were going to build something that was going to bury the NCSA Illinois University mosaic, and it would still have in its name a little hint that they had come from that legacy. And so they put into the code name of the project Mozilla, and that eventually found its way into the user agent. And in 1998, when Netscape created the open source Mozilla project, some of those same people appreciated that little bit of attitude that came about when they created the Mozilla name. And so they named the open source organization, project, and product to build the next generation browser, Mozilla. So that's where we get our name. It sounds a lot like Godzilla. In the very early days, Netscape made a little green fire-breathing dragon mascot that looked a lot like Godzilla. And the owners of the Godzilla trademark, Toho Studios out of Japan, sent a cease and desist notice to Netscape and said, you can't have a green fire-breathing dragon called Mozilla because it sounds a lot like Godzilla and looks a lot like Godzilla. So when we created the open source organization, we converted from a green fire-breathing dragon into a red Tyrannosaurus Rex, which can't be confused with a Godzilla. And Toho agreed to allow us to keep using the name Mozilla and some other Zillas like Bugzilla and some of the other projects that we had. So that's where Mozilla gets its name. Netscape shipped this Netscape browser in end of 1994. They also had a highly successful IPO and raised a whole bunch of money. And Microsoft looked up and noticed that this browser ran on Windows and Macintosh and all of the X's out there, including some crazy legacy Unixes from IBM and a bunch of other people. And it occurred to them, if the browser evolved to a certain level of sophistication, and it doesn't care what OS is underneath it, the browser could devalue the OS. And the OS is Microsoft's cash cow. And they got spooked. And some executives from Microsoft took a little trip down to Mountain View, and they walked into the offices at Netscape and said, hey, we got a plan. Let's split the browser market. You guys take Mac and the Unixes, and we'll take Windows. Something totally illegal if true. A year later, Netscape having resisted that and said no, Microsoft began a very effective campaign to build a browser themselves and to put Netscape out of business. They licensed some code from a company called Spyglass, which had licensed the original NCSA Mosaic code, because universities couldn't license the software directly to commercial entities, so they had this company called Spyglass do that. So if you look at the old copyright notices on Internet Explorer, you'll see Spyglass Mosaic. And that code is what they used to build Internet Explorer 1. It allowed them to turn around the project in short order because they had most of the code right there licensed from a third party. They shipped Internet Explorer 1. It was a crap browser, a 1.0 version, and Netscape was considered far superior. Less than a year later, they shipped version 2, and then less than a year later, they shipped version 3. But in addition to throwing massive engineering resources at it that dwarfed Netscape's resources, they did another thing, which was the really underhanded part. Microsoft, reasonably in my view, bundled Internet Explorer with Windows. Now, some people agree or disagree about whether that's reasonable, but they packaged it up as just another app like the calculator app and like, you know, Notepad, right? It was just another app that comes with Windows. But they went a step farther than that. They went to the people selling the Windows computers. This is Dell and Hewlett-Packard and Compaq and IBM and all of the PC OEMs. And they said, we give you a really sweet deal on Windows licenses. A consumer pays $100 for a Windows license. You pay $14 for a Windows license. Do you like that deal? Do you want to keep that deal? Then you can't ship Netscape anymore. And Netscape made its money at the time by having their software bundled on the desktop of Dell and Hewlett-Packard and Compaq machines. And Netscape was the on-ramp to the internet, and Dell and Hewlett-Packard and Compaq paid Netscape to ship the Netscape browser on the desktop. Now Microsoft comes along and says you can't do that anymore, or you'll end up paying retail for your Windows licenses. Paying retail for a Windows license is going to put any OEM out of business. It's just not possible when all the other guys get, you know, an 85% discount off of retail. So they all stopped bundling Netscape, and Netscape basically tanked. Netscape, with no source of revenue, had no way to pay the bills to fund its developers to continue work on the browser. And in a last-ditch effort to try to keep up competition with Microsoft's juggernaut of engineering talent, great talented people building good high-quality software, Netscape decided they were going to try a crazy tactic. They were going to talk to some of their Linux people. These are the people that built Netscape for the Unix environment, for the open source version of Unix called Linux. They talked to some of them about how well Linux was being developed as a free software project, and could a browser be developed as a free software project. And in November of 1997, they agreed that they were going to take the source code to the next generation communicator browser suite, and they were going to release it to the world as free software. In addition to that, they could no longer charge for the browser, so they're going to give the browser away free. And that was the end of their main source of revenue. So they started focusing on server-side stuff, some enterprise features, things like calendaring and LDAP and stuff like that, trying to make a little bit of money to keep the operation going. But they were basically broke. And they then were relying on the community of people across the internet to come help them take Communicator 5 Alpha and turn it into a shipping release that could compete with IE5. It took them a little while to get that source code out because it turns out that Netscape didn't own the source code to the entire communicator suite. They had licensed code for all kinds of features from third parties, and you can't take third-party code and give it away. It's not yours. So they had to scrub the product of all this code. They also had to remove encryption because back in 1998, encryption was considered military technology, and it was against the law in the United States to make available source code to encryption software that had this degree of encryption that you need in a web browser for SSL. So they had to strip out the encryption, they had to strip out third-party libraries that they had included, and then they put this up on the web, and people looked at it and they said, that's kind of a mess. I don't know if I can do anything with it. At about the same time, the Web Standards Group was forming, and we had a push for an answer to the browser wars, which is that browsers were diverging as IE and Netscape were competing with each other and releasing new releases every 9 months. Web developers got sick of the differences between the two and started to call on the browser vendors to standardize their implementations. Netscape's old source code, some of it that dated back to 1993, was a mess. Developers called it spaghetti. They couldn't find their way around, it was documented poorly, and it had big gaps where pieces had just been ripped out of it wholesale. And so the development community, with support from the Web Standards Group, convinced Mozilla to throw it all away and start over. So at the end of 1998, about a year after the start of the project, Mozilla threw away its entire source code base and started over on a new rendering technology. At the time, it was called NG Layout for the next generation layout technology. Today, we call it Gecko. It is the heart of the Firefox browser. It's what takes the content from the web servers and turns it into what you see on the web page. So rewrites are expensive in terms of time. If any of you are software developers, I'm going to tell you right now, if you have a multi-million line code application, do not throw it all away and start over. You will not have a replacement for that product in time for the market. What we should have done was rewrite section at a time, keeping the whole working. What we did was throw it all away and then start with something that took us a long time to get back to parity. And by parity, I mean parity with the Netscape browser that came before in terms of its ability to handle web content. At the same time, IE 4 and 5 were pretty good releases, and more developers were starting to write pages that were best viewed in IE. And as we were rewriting the Netscape rendering engine, this Gecko rendering engine, we were finding out that we didn't have good compatibility with a bunch of these new websites coming out. And the Web Standards Groups were correct. The web was forking between multiple browser implementations. We did manage, by 2002, to rebuild the a Mozilla version, a clone, as it were, of the Netscape Communicator Suite, which Netscape badged up, Netscape 6, and shipped to the world. It was really poor quality at that time. We had barely finished implementing the basic feature set. We had no time to do stability and performance work on it. But AOL, who had acquired Netscape the year before, came out to Netscape and said, you ship this or we shut you down. So they shipped something called Netscape 6 that bothered all of us who were in Mozilla. It was based on our technology, but it was not fully baked yet. We knew it wasn't ready and had at least a year worth of work left to get it ready. And so we did that year's worth of work, and in June 5th of 2002, and I remember this because June 5th is my birthday and I was the release manager, so I made those two coincide. June 5th of 2002, we shipped Mozilla 1.0. And Mozilla 1.0 was interesting because not only was it sort of a clone of Communicator, but it was a clone of Communicator with modern technologies. And the key piece of those technologies was the Gecko rendering engine. And what was special about our browser was we didn't write our browser in Windows and then do a port of it on Mac and then a port of it on X. We wrote Gecko to be cross-platform, the rendering technology, and then we wrote an entire UI toolkit that was drawn by Gecko itself in the same way it draws web pages. so that we could have a cross-platform product that ran on Mac, Windows, and Linux, but didn't require 3 distinct teams with distinct engineering skills. All they had to have was basically web skills. When you looked at the Mozilla browser, and when you look at the Firefox browser today, and you see a toolbar, and there's a text area in that toolbar that you type an address into, that toolbar is a toolbar. It's an XML tag called toolbar, and it's a Zool tag. We implemented a web-like language that let us draw our UI using the rendering engine that normally draws the web pages. And so when you look at the back button and you see an arrow, that's an image styled with CSS sitting inside of a box, probably a div. And it's got JavaScript handlers associated with it. And the entire front end of the Mozilla browser, email, and HTML authoring suite were written in web-like languages. And this allowed a couple of interesting things to happen. The first thing this allowed was, we're open source, it's web-like languages. It allowed web developers to build features for Mozilla. And one of the first features that a web developer built for Mozilla was a nice tab browsing implementation, what we called an extension. And we still have these today in Firefox. I think most browsers have the idea of extensions. But this extension replaced the whole browser widget with one that was smart enough to be able to do tabs. And we liked it. We all started using it. It was by a guy named H.J. Van Winkle, out of Germany, I believe. He was a bit of a kook, but he wrote this nice extension. We all started using it, and then he started putting all kinds of other features into the extension, and it became like this big behemoth. And Dave Hyatt, one of the engineers working on Mozilla, who had invented Zool, this language that we use to write our user interface in XML, CSS, and JavaScript, Dave implemented a tab browsing implementation directly into Mozilla that was more performant, cleaner, and simpler, and we had tab browsing. And tab browsing, though it wasn't new, we actually modeled our implementation on a browser from 1997 called Netcaptor by a wonderful dude named Adam Stiles. If you ever bump into someone named Adam Stiles, I think he's like mostly doing like Christian sermons these days, but back then he was writing browsers. We modeled our tabbed implementation on his, and it took off. People really, really liked it. By took off, I mean Mozilla and Netscape grew 0.1% in market share over 2 years. The most success we had up to that point, because before that we were just losing, right? 1998, the Mozilla project started. It was downhill in market share from the minute I got involved with that project. In 2000, I left something off. I was volunteering for the first couple of years on this project. In 2000, I got hired by Netscape to work on the Mozilla project. So I came out to California and helped to deliver the Mozilla 1.0 release in 2002, but also around the same time, in the early part of 2002, myself and 3 or 4 other Mozilla contributors decided we wanted to make a browser only. We thought we had some good features in Mozilla 1.0 and Netscape 7. We had built-in tab browsing, which everyone loved, and fixed the mess of how many windows floating around and using the task manager. It's just painful as hell. So we thought, that's really great. We fixed that. We knew that we had an architecture that was very distinct from Microsoft's architecture, meaning all of the exploits that targeted IE just failed in Firefox because we weren't the same code. And we didn't follow the same paths, and we didn't have the same bugs. So we knew we had a security advantage during the nightmare era of viruses and worms spreading on the internet from 2000 to 2005, when it was really, really bad. Bad enough that the US Department of Homeland Security came out in 2004 and said, stop using Internet Explorer, it's not safe, find an alternative. So we knew we were impervious to a lot of those viruses and worms. We had tab browsing that people liked. We built a pop-up blocker, and interestingly enough, when Netscape shipped their Netscape 7 based on Mozilla, they disabled the pop-up blocker. And the reason they disabled the pop-up blocker was because Netscape had been acquired by AOL, and AOL was a media company, and AOL made most of its money off of advertising on the web. And if you make your money off of advertising on the web, you don't want to have a client that blocks that advertising, and pop-ups were really popular back in the 2001, 2002 era. So we had a pop-up blocker, we had tab browsing, we had a pretty good architecture, we had extensions, though not many of them. We had some pretty decent ones. We had a spell checker, which is interesting because we had this email client. You have to have a spell checker and an email client. And since Gecko was rendering the email client and Gecko's rendering a web page, a text area in the two is the same thing, so we can turn on the spell checker in the browser. Remember 2001, 2, and 3 when like blogs were born and people started typing online a lot? Before that, people published offline, regular people. But by 2002, regular old people out there were posting online, and they appreciated not posting typos. So our little spell checker made a difference. This all came together in 2004 to be Firefox. But before that came together, a couple of interesting things happened. I mentioned earlier on that Microsoft had some dirty tactics when they were trying to plow Netscape under the ground. When AOL bought Netscape, AOL realized that Microsoft had been found guilty by the US Department of Justice of antitrust violations. So AOL Netscape sued Microsoft for all the money in the world. You are found guilty in a US court of destroying our business, and we're gonna reap the benefits. That lawsuit settled a year later. Microsoft paid AOL about $750 million to make that go away, which is peanuts, it's nothing. AOL had paid many, many times more than that to buy Netscape. And they agreed as part of that AOL would shut down Netscape as a technology development organization. That AOL, at the time it was AOL Time Warner, because they had merged with Time Warner, most disastrous merger and all, $99 billion loss in one day. I don't know how you get to that, but they were having a tough time. And they were laying people off left and right. They fired Mitchell Baker, the head of Mozilla, and she went out and started raising money for creating a nonprofit structure to house the Mozilla development when Netscape ultimately gave up on it, something we knew was coming. Microsoft settled that. They also, about 6 months before, shipped Windows XP, their most successful release of all time, that came with IE6 bundled, a wonderful browser. We laugh at it today, but in 2002, IE6 was pretty badass, pretty awesome. Where do you think we got Ajax from? It came out of IE6, XML HTTP request, right? Microsoft had put together a good product, but they had 95% of the market. And what did they do after they shipped IE6? And after they settled with AOL to kill the Netscape browser, they realized they killed their last competitor. No more other browsers. IE's the only one. They shut the team down. People went off to MSN TV. They had bought Web TV a couple years before, rebranded as MSN TV. People went off to work on Longhorn and Avalon stuff. People went to work on .NET and the CLR and what would eventually become the Windows Internet Network, right, to replace the World Wide Web. Microsoft had decided at this point they succeeded in ending Netscape's threat to Windows. And we're going to now put their resources into making Windows the client you want to get on the net with, to making a Windows wide web instead of a World Wide Web. We saw this and said, we're not dead yet, right? We started the Mozilla Nonprofit Foundation in 2003, hired 8 people out of the layoffs of Netscape. I was one of those 8 people. And we went to work on this little side project that me and 4 or 5 others had been working on for a while, which was, we saw this Mozilla browser and these Netscape browsers, and when we had done our best with those, they were only able to add about half a point market share, which isn't enough to have even a seat at the table in the standards bodies, to have anyone care about you, to have anyone think of you as anything but a loser in the browser market. And we looked at this and we said, why is it that we put all this energy in and Netscape isn't able to make a dent in market share with all of their marketing prowess and all of AOL Time Warner behind them? And we started looking at examples like the pop-up blocker. We built a feature users loved. Netscape took our code, which they had many engineers contributing to. It was a Netscape engineer that implemented the pop-up blocker in Mozilla. They took Mozilla 1.0, they rebadged it as Netscape 7, and turned off the pop-up blocker. And so it became obvious to us that these guys were not going to be able to succeed in satisfying the needs of customers out there because they were too focused on their business interest, which was advertising on the web. And so a small group of us decided we needed to do something on our own. Mozilla 1.0 was a communicator clone. No one wants a communicator clone anymore. There aren't any more communicator users to upgrade to. What are people on? They're on IE and Outlook. We decided we couldn't take them on both at the same time, and that meant decoupling the product, which previously had a browser, an email client, HTML authoring tool, into a browser and separate email client. And a group of us went to work on this browser, started off, I'm going to get into an interesting second naming discussion, started off as just being called browser because in the old Mozilla world, the browser was called Navigator, coming from Netscape's nomenclature, and we didn't have any creative names, so we just called ours browser. And in the source code repository, it lived under the directory Mozilla/browser. So we all started calling it MB, the 5 or 6 of us that were working on it for Mozilla/browser. And then it got time to actually show this to some people beyond the 5 of us, and we said we need a better name than MB because MB just does not resonate, no one's going to know what it is. And I proposed Phoenix. Hey, rising from the ashes of Mozilla and Netscape, Phoenix, it's perfect, right? So we called it the Phoenix browser, and off of my weblog, we released Phoenix 0.1. A little side project, not the official Mozilla project. We were still pushing Mozilla 1.0, 1.1, 1.2. And Phoenix 0.1 got more downloads than Mozilla 1.0. A pre-alpha build launched off of my weblog ultimately got more downloads than the launch of our premier product that came 3 months before. So we knew we had something good on our hands. And what we had done is we had taken the browser and we had taken away all the Netscape-isms, the things that would be foreign to an IE user, like keyboard shortcuts that didn't line up. We knew there were no more Netscape users looking to upgrade. They were all on IE, 95% of them. So we adjusted our keyboard shortcuts and things like that. But we knew we had a few key features, the pop-up blocking, the tab browsing, the integrated search, the spell checker. We put them into a very tight little package. We spent about 2 years polishing up those features. And in 2004, we shipped Firefox 1, and it immediately, in 6 months, took 10% market share away from Microsoft. They were at 95%. We step back again to 2002. In 2002, when they shut down the IE team and moved them off to other projects, they basically said the web is done. We're going to start working on the Windows-only web now, something called .NET. They had their passport for single sign-on. Everyone in the whole web was going to be using a Microsoft sign-in. Kind of familiar. Facebook pushing that these days, Twitter pushing that these days, but Microsoft had the idea that it was going to be one and theirs, and they would have all the data on their servers. This was the push they were going to make to co-opt the web. They had 95% of it, and they didn't want it to get better. They didn't want it to grow into something that could compete with Windows itself. And so in shutting down the team, settling with AOL to kill its only competitor, they had decided the web was done in 2002. We disagreed. We started this little MB, then Phoenix. I like the name Phoenix a lot. We got a beautiful logo someone in our community made up for us of a flaming bird. I was really, really happy, and then I got an email from a company called Phoenix Technologies. And Phoenix Technologies said, you're using our trademark and you have to stop immediately or we're going to sue you. Now, I'd been through a couple of trademark issues before with the Camino browser, a little Mac-only browser we'd made. It was called Chimera initially. There was another browser called Chimera that open sourced 1998, never had another check-in after 98. Pretty dead, but I'd been through a couple of these trademark issues. And so I wrote Phoenix Technologies an email back going, we make a web browser, you make a BIOS. There's not going to be consumer confusion between a web browser and a BIOS. So go ahead and sue me. You'll lose. They wrote me back within about 30 seconds with a screenshot of the browser they make. And I went, oh no. They apparently make a tiny little browser that lives in the BIOS. So if you have a problem with a driver, you can boot into the BIOS, go to the web, and download a driver. And even though it wasn't a full web browser, it was enough that there could be actual trademark infringement. So we had to change the name. But I loved this flaming bird logo we had. And so as we sat down and dreamed up another name, we decided, hey, Firebird, that's what it is, right? It's a flaming bird. Firebird sounds pretty good, and the car's a hot rod American muscle car. Don't make them anymore. We don't have to worry about trademark conflicts there. So we named it Firebird, and we did a new launch, version 0.7. And then I woke up Monday morning to about 300 emails in my inbox, all of them, I believe, in Portuguese, coming from Brazil, from a small community of open source developers who make a database called Firebird, screaming at me and calling me names for stealing their name and ruining their Google page rank. They were like, we lost our #1 spot at Google. I'm like, you didn't lose your #1 spot. You lost the first 3 pages, right? Like, Mozilla had enough momentum that when we put a name on the web, it got picked up. And I felt kind of bad because it's one project stomping on a little project, so we had to change our name again. We eventually settled on this idea that Firebird, we had named our email client Thunderbird to pair with Firebird. So we had Firebird and Thunderbird. And we didn't have to rename the email client, and we still had Thunderbird. So we liked this idea of forces of nature and an animal, right? So we put them all up on the whiteboard, and we eventually came up with Firefox for the name. Went and looked into that, and there was a movie and a novel, a Clint Eastwood movie, but not much conflicting, so we settled on that name. And it turns out that that name and logo actually had a pretty positive impact. It became immediately recognizable in a way that nothing we had done before. Certainly the name Mozilla did not have anywhere near the traction. We had 6 years as Mozilla, and the day after we released Firefox, no one in the news even knew what our name was. We were just the Firefox browser maker. Firefox took over as the name. So Firefox was kind of a magic happening. Microsoft had shut its team down, stopped investing for several years, and let its security track record go to hell. We'd continued investing, and several of the people who initially worked on Firefox, first starting with Dave Hyatt, went to Apple and started the WebKit project that became Safari. And so we now had 2 browsers from the same people, even at different companies, Mozilla and Apple, who had some of the same reasons for building a browser, to bring competition back, to give choice to people so you didn't get stuck with what came on your system. You might prefer the look and feel. It might be vanilla versus chocolate. It might be security versus insecurity, right? But we wanted there to be choice. And how many people here know that Mozilla is a nonprofit? Okay, good. We're a nonprofit, for those of you who don't know. And our legal tax responsibility as a nonprofit is to serve the public, right? Is to serve the public, to create a public good. And we do that with software. And what we do is we take all of our values and we package them into the software we deliver, and the software is sort of a Trojan horse for our values and our mission. And our values and mission are putting users in control of their online experience and giving them choice and opportunity. And with the release of Firefox and the release of Safari, with a wonderful person, Dave Hyatt, working on it, and a few years later, the release of Chrome, and now I'd say even the release of IE 10 and 11 and upcoming 12, we have succeeded. We have choice and competition in the desktop browser. And I don't begrudge anyone who uses any of those browsers. I move between them. I have close, dear friends and family members who happily use Chrome and happily use Safari and happily use IE. And I don't try to get them to switch to Firefox because we fixed the problem we set out to solve, which is there was no choice. The only one you could use was the one that came with your system. And it was so dangerous to use that the Department of Homeland Security was telling you not to use it. That problem is now fully solved. Now, I still think there's great room for browsers to progress in terms of the features they offer users. There's a lot of room for the rendering engines and the web platform itself to progress. But the idea that we need to win a browser war or even change a browser war is gone. It's thriving, it's beautiful. The 5 biggest software companies in the world are all spending billions of dollars making browsers. Well, we don't have billions, but the other guys do. So we fixed kind of the browser problem, and while we did that, we created some pretty amazing advances in the platform itself, what the web could do. We ditched this idea that the web was going to transform itself into XML, which is what the W3C started trying to do in about 2001 with XA-HTML. They wanted the whole web to rewrite itself in XML. Right? Like all the sites they thought would rewrite themselves. We followed them for a couple of years and we realized that wasn't really a good path, and so we started working with our friend Dave over at Apple on WebKit. And another friend of ours, Ian Hickson, who had worked on Mozilla and was now at Opera, to standardize a couple new features that we agreed that the browser makers ought to make. Microsoft was out of the game. They weren't even playing, right? So the 3 remaining browser vendors got together and added a couple of new tags to HTML. And we didn't go like to the W3C and propose them and have them get shot down because they weren't XML. We just did it. And we decided that we would do it and we would specify those clearly, so if a new browser vendor came along and wanted to do it, they could do it. But we essentially abandoned the W3C in favor of a browser consortium. The W3C, if you don't know this, like the CSS working group has representatives from Boeing, right? Like these aren't browser makers. These are companies that have big XML intranets and stuff like that, and they were running the W3C. So we just sidestepped it and we implemented Canvas and started doing a whole bunch of new things, and HTML5 was born. We also saw a revolution happen in websites with Google coming along with Maps and others that took advantage of XML HTTP request, an IE invention that we shamelessly ripped off like immediately because it was a good feature, and that so did Safari. And we had the performance and security and a couple of new features. So we jump-started browser development, both from a UI and what the user experiences in terms of features like tab browsing and pop-up blocking and integrated search. But we also re-jump-started the rendering engine game, the platform of the web that lets you build rich experiences. Microsoft, having seen 10% of their market share go away in 6 months, reassembled the IE team. And I knew a bunch of people on that team, so they were like, the band's getting back together, yay! And they did turn around and ship a new product that had tab browsing, yay, tab browsing for everyone. But it was still a crappy browser, it was still Trident from IE 6. Today it's in much, much better shape. IE, like I said, IE 11, they even support WebGL, and so does iOS 8. This is wonderful. We're actually able to add new technologies to the web, like WebGL for 3D, and have all the browser makers adopt it in a reasonable period of time. So, having declared mission accomplished on browser choice and competition, we looked up and we noticed that finally, for 10 years, people had told us the mobile revolution is coming, but it wasn't until 2007 with iOS and the launch of the first iPhone that it became clear that you could carry a real computer in your pocket that could do real things beyond just a phone. That didn't require you make huge sacrifices in usability. It didn't have WAP on it and crap like that, these trimmed down horrible versions of the web that never went anywhere. Sorry if any of you are WAP people. Ex-WAP, former WAP people, recovering WAP people? I don't know. Recovering WAP people. So we saw that mobile was in a similar position to where browsing was. And we looked up and we noted that the next 5 billion people to come online are going to come online with mobile as their first experience of online. So we decided we better get a mobile browser going. We looked all around, and Apple said you can't put a browser on our system, so that one was out. Android didn't exist yet, so we looked at Windows CE and some Linux-based solutions that eventually became Migo and Mamo and Jola. I'm never sure whether it's a hard or soft J. Nevertheless, we tried several attempts to build a browser on mobile to try to re-inject some competition in the mobile space. But that doesn't really work because people on mobile were moving much more toward an app ecosystem and away from a web ecosystem. And in order to have an impact on that, we realized we had to build not just a browser on a mobile ecosystem. We had to build a mobile ecosystem that looked and behaved like the web, that had the high quality features of interoperability and no permission, no gatekeepers. You can put up a web page, you don't have to ask someone. You can sell something on that web page, you don't have to ask someone. You can put up a software download, you don't have to ask someone. Go to the Play Store or go to the App Store at Apple and you have to ask their permission and they can say no. They can kill your business. They told us no, we can't put a browser in their store because it would compete with them in a way they just didn't want, right? It's as simple as that. So we decided we needed to build a mobile ecosystem that shared in the ethos of the web, that is all about progress and standing on the shoulders of giants and openness and interoperability and public documented standards and shared protocols. And so what we did was about 3 years ago, we took a Linux kernel, actually out of Android, and the Android HAL, and we put Gecko right on top of it, our rendering engine, nothing else in between. Just basically the kernel and the browser with no browser frame around it. And we wrote a couple of simple apps in it, including a dialer that could access the radio in the device and make a phone call. And one of our research engineers, Andreas Gall, prototyped this and showed it off to the team at an all hands. The following week, he put it up on GitHub and did a post into our news group saying, B2G is open for business. And here comes my third naming story. First, we had the Mosaic becomes Mozilla. Then we had Phoenix, MB becomes Phoenix, becomes Firebird, becomes Firefox. We started off with this idea of boot to Gecko. And the idea was we need to attract developers. This is a very early project. This is not a consumer project. Developers knew what Gecko was, and we had a lot of fans in the web development community who appreciated Gecko as being a standards-compliant, capable rendering engine. And we wanted to denote that this phone was booting directly into that rendering engine with nothing in between, no extra layers of abstraction. So we built a prototype. That January, which was, I guess, about 4 months later, we went to Mobile World Congress, and we showed off a prototype. And people were pretty wowed by it, and we found a few more partners. We partnered up with Telefonica, and they were working on a HTML5-based front end for phones. The following year, we came back and we showed off a pre-release of 1.0 of Firefox OS. Boot to Gecko and B2G, the code name for, or the condensed form of Boot to Gecko, just didn't really roll off the tongue or ring well as a consumer product. And our partners who would actually build phones and the carriers and operators who would support those phones didn't want to brand their phones Boot to Gecko. They didn't like it at all. And they did like the name Firefox. So we decided it was going to be Firefox OS, a pretty obvious win. It is the same Gecko. So what we do is we take this Android kernel and HAL, and that's sort of a little Linux distro we make, a tiny little Linux distro. And then we port Gecko to that distro, just like we port Gecko to Mac and to Windows and to Linux and to whatever else is out there. We port our Gecko to that little mini Linux stack and we put it on there, and then we build HTML5 apps on top of that, a dialer, a address book, a camera, those kinds of things. And that layer is called Gaia. And so if you want to bring Firefox OS to a new device, all you have to do is port that base layer to your device. All you have to do is bring over a compatible Linux and HAL, have those working, and we already have the porting work of Gecko to that piece done. And on top of Gecko lives the HTML5 apps that make up the user experience of the phone. And so we're now in a position where we have, I think, 25 markets we're selling Firefox OS phones. We've got 9 global carriers and their subsidiaries and subdivisions and a few other local carriers. We've got 9 different handsets in market from 5 different OEMs based on 3 different chipsets. So we now have the basics of a deployed OS with, I'm going to say, about 1 million users have adopted it so far in the 1 year or so since we've been out there in the market. Our latest push has been in ultra low cost. One of the things we discovered was we can run Gecko and our Gaia layer of apps in 128 megs RAM. We could do that because we've been optimizing for older Windows XP PCs and similar. And it turns out that none of the other mobile operating systems can really fit into that space. And so we worked with Spreadtrum, a chipset maker who I think is here, to put together a reference platform for something we called the $25 phone. This was the idea that you could build a complete contemporary smartphone with touch, with apps, with the web, with HTML5, the best HTML5 web browser on the planet, and you could fit it into a device that we could get the cost down to between $25 and $30. Those phones just went into market in India and Bangladesh in the last couple of weeks. They've sold out all of their stocks. They're projecting, you know, a million, 1.5 million sales by the time we get to the holiday season. It's a true smartphone for the cost of a feature phone. I'm finding people in the West are buying it just to tear it apart for hardware hacking because it's got a lot of great stuff in it for 30 bucks. But one of the things we really care about, like I said we did earlier, was that everyone in the world have access. So we've got two major things going on with Firefox OS. The first is we're trying to drive the prices down of the entire mobile ecosystem. We believe by putting a $25 phone out there at Mobile World Congress in January, we've had a major impact on the cost structures, pricing structures of all of the other vendors, including Google One with its $100 India phone. The Microsoft's been dropping its prices down to the $100 price point. We're still a third of that, so you can buy 3 Firefox OS phones for 1 Google One phone. And then the second thing we want to do is we want to build into our phone the features that bring all of us online in control of our own experience the same way the browser has. So we're looking at obvious things like permissions. Don't you hate it when you get a new app and it wants every permission for every piece of hardware on your device before you've even played with it? That's not how Firefox OS works. Firefox OS works, you go to the marketplace, you play the game or play with the app live because it's hosted in the marketplace as a hosted app before you even decide if you want to use it. And when you install it, it asks for permissions on a per-use basis, meaning if you've got an app that's all about reading the news and it wants your camera, you don't have to give it your camera on day one. You can wait until there's actually a use case where it wants your camera before you say yes or no to that permission. These are the kinds of things that would come out of a Mozilla project that wouldn't necessarily come out of a Google or an Apple or a Microsoft project where their business goals are so different than ours. Our goals, like with Firefox, are to bring competition, choice, opportunity, and to put users at the center of the experience. And so just like the $25 phone caused the rest of the mobile industry to consider these low price points in these emerging markets and to start chasing them, we believe that the features that we build into Firefox OS are also going to force the competition to start thinking about those same features, the way IE added tab browsing and pop-up blocking. We want to add privacy and control and security to the Firefox OS platform. We want to add ease of use and ease of development. We want to take the 10 million iOS and Android developers out there. We got 100 million web developers just waiting to crush them. Sorry. If we can complete the APIs that allow our platform to do everything those other platforms do. We're 90% there. We've got pretty much any phone API you can think of. We've got web Bluetooth, we've got web NFC, we've got web video, we've got web audio, we've got vibration and sensors and proximity and geolocation and gyro and all of the pieces that make up your phone. We now have standards or standards track DOM APIs that you can call from your JavaScript and HTML to poke at those bits in the phone. When I open up a Firefox phone and I start dialing a number, that dialer is like a web page, a web app that is built up out of CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. And when I press those buttons, there's an interface that talks down to the real stack that is a web standard proposal track interface that we think all devices are going to implement. And I want to offer up one little view of the future, which is that 5 years from now, all mobile operating systems will have a first-class web platform as a target for their system. In the same way, when you open up Visual Studio today, Microsoft gives you a choice of C++ projects, .NET CLR projects, or HTML5 projects. And Microsoft has 3 platforms it supports inside of Windows, those 3 different APIs. I believe all mobile systems will adopt the APIs that we're building now, and you'll be able to write first-class applications with extremely good performance, including all the features you want. We do first-person shooter games from Unreal at full HD resolution, 60 frames per second on a phone right now with WebGL, JavaScript, and ASM.js. And I think we'll see Microsoft is already coming on board with HTML5 apps. Google is moving that way and blending the line between what's a browser tab and what's an app. Apple will probably be the last to come along, like they are with many things that weren't invented at Apple. But 5 years from now, HTML5 and its 200 million developers will be the primary mobile development platform, and we will have been there first, have the most experience, and the most robust implementation. We hope we can get there faster by porting to more devices and by providing people who have unsupported devices from their manufacturers manufacturer another alternative for flashing a new and better operating system. We're working out a mechanism that will allow you to flash your phone to Firefox OS directly from the Firefox browser without the need to set up, ADB and all these other kind of things, like so that a regular consumer who had a phone that was unsupported by their manufacturer could plug it into their laptop, hit go in Firefox, and have a fresh, security-supported, new features, live contemporary mobile operating system. And the way we're going to get there is if we can get some help porting to some of these old devices to figure out where the challenges are, where the lines are, how far back are we really going to go, and how we can do a better job at serving all those people who have been abandoned by their Android vendors, whether it's the carrier or the operator, whether it's carrier operator or the handset maker who just refuses. We're gonna fix some of those problems by doing the right thing at Mozilla, by getting a large group of people to help us do that right thing, and hope to influence the rest of the industry to bend toward more consumer, more user-friendly projects, more developer-friendly projects. I apologize, this was not the technical talk some of you were hoping for. I had expected that one of my colleagues was going to be here for a talk earlier that would cover some of that technical, but I wanted to share with you where we're going and to tell you a little of the success story of Firefox, because I believe we're going to repeat that story. It didn't happen overnight. Like I said, I joined Mozilla when it started in 1998. We didn't ship Firefox till the end of 2004. We're moving faster than that because we're bigger now and we've got more experience and we've got Gecko. But it's going to be a couple of years, but I think we're going to bend this thing back toward open, interoperable implementations. Today, you can not only fork Firefox OS and do your own thing with it, you can fork our marketplace and set it up at your own website, and you've got a marketplace in a box. And it doesn't compete with us. We don't care. We think that's wonderful. I'd love to see someone fork the game section and do it real justice by building a game center for Firefox OS. And if it's not a Mozilla property, that's no problem at all. I'd love to see someone make some money off of these things. So think about not just forking our core browser and OS projects, but the support and services around them. And think about joining us as we try to port to a bunch more in-market hardware, while Mozilla focuses its limited resources on a few new devices coming from OEMs and carriers. And hopefully we'll get the whole world have the same kind of access to Firefox OS that they have today with the Firefox web browser. Thank you all.